we just heard was a graphic depiction of that rejection. We read that in chapter 7 of the Gospel of John. Remember in verse 1, after this, Jesus went about in Galilee. He went not to go about in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him. So the ultimate consummation of this rejection is found in his graphic depiction of death. This is how Jesus died. That is one of the causes of rejection. Often we see the life of Christ and we see his death as a portrayal of love for his children. And that is true. But we cannot negate or forget this other concept that we have in the cross, which is not only God's love, but the world's rejection of Christ. And once again, confronted with that reality, we have that choice to make in our own lives. Do we reject or do we follow? And as we've seen throughout this entire gospel, we are called to be disciples of Christ, and we are called to follow Christ, believe in his word, and obey. If not, we can just simply choose to leave him and abandon him right where he stands, which is what is done in chapter 7. So let me call your attention to John chapter 7, back in verse 14. We began to discuss last week this concept of Jesus being completely rejected in public during the feast that was supposed to be celebrating this concept of God's presence. What was that feast called? The Feast of Tabernacles. Jesus was there, and the religious authorities, as well as the crowds, did not understand that the true tabernacle was in place. That's very ironic that they would continue in their religious duties and still completely miss who Jesus was. So friends, as we continue in our study through verse 24 today, we're going to get this reminder that oftentimes religion itself blocks our view of Christ. And what we're going to see in verses 14 through 24 is not only religion and this establishment of religion blocks our view to Christ, but also apathy. Being in church, as we in our modern times, isn't the only hindrance at times to see Christ, because not only church can block the view in religious authority, but also our very own lifestyle, our apathy towards Christ. We've seen him, we know what he has done, and yet our lives are just okay without him, and so we move on. So those are some very clear depictions of what we're going to be seeing in verses 14 through 24. And last week we opened up in verses 14 through 15. And from this point on, we're going to be on 16 through 24. But a reminder is that Jesus himself has entered this human drama, if we want to put it that way, as light enters the darkness. And this is a theme that we've seen since John chapter 1. Light comes into the world and the darkness rejects it. Why? Because the light, what it does is that it reveals the truth, and it reveals the true human condition. It shows us who we really are. Many of us cannot judge adequately what is in a person's heart. Oftentimes we have this discussion with our significant other, and we ask them, what's wrong? Because we see them with a frown on their face, and the famous response to the question, what's wrong, is nothing. Nothing's wrong. And we all know that there's something wrong. But you see, what Jesus does is that he penetrates the deep human condition by revealing all that is within the human heart. It is a penetrating force of judgment upon human sin. Penetrates the darkness and reveals what is truly there. What's in your heart? That's what we have to face every day. That's what we have to understand. That's what Jesus has done. And we get this, and we begin to see once more why this rejection is so prevalent. Remember where Jesus is in verse 14? He's in the temple. He's in the most public arena during one of the most famous holidays or festivals. And he's preaching, and what he's preaching and what he's doing is not accepted. And it could be because what he is saying is revealing, and it is showing the true deep condition. And we're going to see that as we keep going through these verses. The good news of the gospel doesn't always have a welcoming audience. You can imagine Jesus' words as he stood in the temple. You could imagine what Jesus was preaching. Look, you have access to all the best preachers in the world today. You could go online. As a matter of fact, you can go on Facebook right now, and there's probably 20,000 other preachers out there that are much better than I am, and you can really listen in and tune in and be like, I like the way this guy speaks a little bit more than what this guy's saying. And you have your buffet to choose from. But we've never really heard a preacher quite like Jesus. And what is most amazing is that as Jesus is preaching, he is being rejected. The greatest preacher in the world with the greatest message in the world is being publicly rejected in the temple, where he is supposedly the very presence of God. In the temple, he is rejected. So it is improper to simply think that by acting out the gospel, as many of us have intended to do so, or what we call it, living the gospel, with an impeccable testimony, will be enough to convert unbelieving audiences. You see, Jesus is preaching here, and not only is Jesus preaching, but he's also lived a perfect life. Now, we've always heard this phrase, and it pops out every once in a while, where it continually brings you into perspective by saying, you just have to live out the gospel. You just have to live it and show it. You don't have to say it. Just show us what you believe with your actions, and people will be more attentive. People will be more inclined to follow what you would preach, right? It makes sense, kind of like practice what you preach, but more so on the level of, don't even preach, just do it. And so we've often heard this, and we think that by just doing, people will be more receptive. Well, Jesus completely destroys that phrase. No. You have to preach, and you have to act, and regardless, people are going to reject your message. Several years back, there was this, I don't know if it was a documentary or a comedy by one of Christianity's greatest opponents in the liberal world, Bill Maher. He's a comedian as well as a political analyst. And Bill Maher made a documentary called Religulous. I don't know if you've seen that. And in this documentary, what infuriated many Christians was that Bill Maher, this renowned atheist in the liberal world and hates Christianity, and he always talks bad about it, Bill Maher interviews and goes to all these weirdo churches, weird Christians. I mean, he goes into places where they step on snakes and stuff. And he interviews these weird Christians that live lavish lifestyles. He points out pastors that have alligator shoes that cost thousands of dollars and suits that cost thousands of dollars. And he's pointing them out. And throughout this entire time, I'm like, man, if only Bill Maher would interview true Christians. Man, go to a real church to hear the real message, and maybe you would be converted. Well, friends, that's not always the case. Why? Because the world is not eager or receptive. They're not waiting to be filled with the presence of God. People like Bill Maher hate God, and they try to convince everyone to do the same. As a matter of fact, Bill Maher hates the person he supposedly says doesn't exist. which is in reality a contradiction. But what we begin to see is not only in the world's sense here, in the public temple and Jesus' preaching, but even the religious community jumps in to reject Christ. And religious community is no better. It is simply a sophisticated rebellion against God. Every time the gospel is preached, Jesus is on trial. You can't wait to have a receptive audience when you present the gospel, because the gospel divides. The gospel reveals. The gospel is light. And our hearts are in need of light because our hearts are dark. So in this context, friends, as we see Jesus in the temple refuting the religious establishment as well as the crowds, we'll begin to see what does it mean for us to accept Christ or reject him. And we can see that there's many ways to do so. So in this passage, I want you to highlight or at least bracket off verses 16 and 18, because the response Jesus has to this public rejection is threefold. In verses 16 through 18, Jesus shows his authority or proves his authority because they were confused as to where Jesus comes from. And he also shows them how ignorant they are to their own law. In verses 19 through 23, Jesus again shows their faulty execution of the law. So not only do they not properly understand the law, Jesus points out that the religious community doesn't even know how to work the law. And he also points out their hypocrisy. And in verse 24 is Jesus' final response as a form of exhortation to everyone. Not only first century Jews and first century temple goers, but even 21st century Christians in Cicero, Illinois. So let's examine Jesus' first response in verses 16 through 18. Jesus answers his critics. His authority rests not on the wisdom of this world, as he says in verse 16. If you look with me in verse 16, you'll see that Jesus responds, "My teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. If anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I am speaking on my own authority. The one who speaks on his own authority seeks his own glory, but the one who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true, and in him there is no falsehood." Where does his authority come from? His authority comes from the one who has sent him. So several things are going on here. First, Jesus points out that he is not offering some new doctrine. And this goes straight into the face of religion and hypocrisy. He isn't teaching anything new, per se. Jesus, as the revealer of God, bears the words of God, and they themselves, as leaders of the law and of religion, don't get it. They don't understand what Jesus is saying. And this is why we read Deuteronomy chapter 18. Because in Deuteronomy chapter 18, Jesus is this messianic figure that is pointed to us by the Lord himself. And the Lord is telling Moses that he will raise a prophet like him, and God will put his words in his mouth in order for him to teach the world about him. And if God would do that in this messianic person, then it would be easy for those who follow this law to understand it, correct? If they've dedicated themselves to the law and to Scripture, they would know that what he is saying comes from God, because he would be this fulfillment of this prophecy. Moses, in the book of Deuteronomy, is pointing to Christ, and they still do not understand. Jesus, what he is saying in these brief verses is that he is not self-taught and he isn't introducing some new type of concept or doctrine. Rather, he is the consummation of everything that they've learned as well as its revelation. We see the glory of God in the face of Jesus, yet they could not see it. If they know the law and they claim to abide by the law, then this should be easy for them to get, but they don't. Second aspect that's going on within these verses is that Christ's call is unique. His role is unique. He is a teacher, the one with the authority of the one who has sent him. This is God Almighty himself. No one else can make this claim because Jesus is the only unique figure. Why do we know this? And why is this important? Because Jesus consistently throughout his ministry stresses the fact that after him will come many false messiahs and false prophets. This is what he says in Matthew chapter 24, verses 4 through 5, that he warns the people and his disciples that many deceivers will come. Many deceivers will act as though they are the new Messiah or the coming Messiah. Jesus calls them false messiahs and false prophets in verse 24 of Matthew 24. They are impersonators. They are false. And they will even try to lead away what Jesus says, the elect. Jesus is warning that there is no one else like him. He is the only one capable of fulfilling this role. And up until that point, Jesus has proved it not only by his words, but he has also proved it by his actions. See, there's nothing that the law or the leaders or anyone could say against Jesus because he's lived a perfect life. We're not talking about 5-year-old Jesus. We're not talking about 10-year-old Jesus. We're talking about Jesus, the man who has lived years on the earth and has shown that he has no tail to step on. That there aren't any skeletons in his closet that will come up and bite him. Jesus is perfect and Jesus is unique. No one else can fulfill that role. Once again, should the teachers of the law know this? Yes. But they don't, and they don't accept it. Why? Because the religious rulers of that day, as well as everyone else, is seeking prestige, is seeking the name, is seeking fame. Here, the religious world wanted those who speak at the temple to represent the highest levels of education. It's often the case that the world is often taken back by titles. That's why they wanted to know who taught Jesus. We spoke about this last week. Well, if you're teaching, then that means you have a better teacher. That means you've learned from a good pedigree. You have all of these titles behind you. You have a right to be in the temple. But Jesus had no earthly authority, had no worldly renowned names. And oftentimes the world, what it does, especially even in the first century, and we're no different from the first century, they wanted the names, they wanted the prestige, and they wanted those honorous titles so that they can say they sat under the teaching of some great Pharisee. It's basically what we have in our modern day, like being introduced and feeling that sense of pride when you're introduced as Dr. Garcia or Mrs. Gonzalez, PhD. Those little letters at the end of your name are very important. Or if you're in the marketplace, these titles like founder, best-selling author, and president at so-and-so group. I was recently, in order to get some of these interesting titles, I was visiting a very renowned leadership summit that occurs here in Chicago. And it used to be on the church end. They used to have pastors leading the summit, teaching the church how to lead. But there isn't any pastors on that. Well, there's only one pastor on that leadership summit for 2021. And most of the titles that are found on that leadership summit sound exactly like this: founder, best-selling author, president, CEO, innovating director. That's pretty nice. I recently heard of a new title that drew me back. I mean, in the church world, you're used to pastors and deacons and elders. But there was this new title that I'd never seen in the Bible, but it drew me back. I was like, wow, this is prestigious. Global Senior Pastors. That was a title for a pastoral role. I was like, well, how do I apply for that job? I want to be a global senior pastor. That'd be epic, right? If you guys came to our church and be like, hey, our pastor is a global senior pastor. What does that mean? I have no idea. But that's a title, and it sounds cool. Well, I mean, it's not in the Bible, so that would never happen here. But these titles, just like in Jesus' days, were prestigious, and they caused attention. Jesus needed no titles. Jesus was the Son of God. And he was rejected. So as Jesus proves his authority, he furthers his argument by turning his argument on them. In verse 17, they should know God's will, is basically what Jesus is telling them. Supposedly, they are the ones to do the work. I mean, this religious world and this Jewish custom is all about doing and working. And if they're doing and working God's will, then they should recognize that the works Jesus has done come from God. Do you remember Nicodemus in chapter 3? This is the difference. Nicodemus, a prominent Pharisee of his time. If you don't remember what we spoke about in Nicodemus, go back a couple this year or last year, and you'll find our teaching on chapter 3. But Nicodemus enters this discussion with Jesus, and he goes to Jesus by night. And in chapter 3, verse 2, Nicodemus realizes this: no one could do what you do, so you must be from God. So Nicodemus has this understanding, hey, there's something different about you. And he comes to Jesus with this understanding. So it could be done. Yet, most of these religious authorities didn't know. They didn't have the law in their heart. And they would often cover it up by their hypocritical piety. See, they did not desire to do God's will. We see this time and time again. Jesus calls them out and says, you honor me with your lips, but your hearts are far from me. And therefore, they could not recognize Jesus, not even his actions. And if they can't even recognize Jesus, that means that whatever they've been doing up until that point, and again, the irony of this entire argument is that they're in the middle of a feast that is supposed to be celebrating the presence of God. What is going on? It's religious custom that's going on. This is religion at its best. Just go to church, do your thing, and you're cool. You fulfilled your role. They don't know, they don't recognize him. For him, God's will in their lives was only a theoretical understanding of God, but never quite a practical one. That's why everyone hated the Pharisees. The only ones that looked up to the Pharisees were other religious people that wanted to become like them. They were the ones with the money. They're the ones with the fame. But they had no practice or praxis in their theory or in their theology. And doing God's will would then require of the religious establishment to be obedient, but they couldn't be obedient because they couldn't obey the words of Christ, of Jesus. Everything Jesus said was rejected. Again, in this works-based religion, the Jews that followed and supposedly were to be acting or doing God's will had no actions to show. Everything that they did was a superficial understanding of religion. They just did their religious duties and moved on with their life. By the time we get to verse 18, Jesus really points out what the issue is in their lives. See, they want a teacher to have prestige behind him, right? They want the titles behind the teacher. But more so, they want to satisfy their own glory. Teachers in those days, like many people in our modern day, often feel good when they have the glory for themselves. We can't lie. We like it. We like to be acknowledged. We like when people tell us, man, you're a great preacher. Man, that preaching was so good. We love that. Man, that was top-notch homiletics. Or when they look at you and they say, man, you're an amazing person. Man, everything that you do is amazing. Man, I've been seeing your Instagram story. Dang, bro, that's awesome. You're good. And you're like, yeah. I got 1.5K followers on Instagram. And my TikTok is blowing up. We like that. Jesus points them out and says, you guys are seeking your own glory. I'm not seeking my own glory. Jesus says, the one who sent me has given me authority. I'm seeking to do his will and to glorify him. Problem is that religion doesn't change the heart. And so what's inside the heart of people is really this desire for the glory of themselves. I am the one in charge. I am the authority figure. Me. And Jesus says, him. He sent me. We honor him. He's the one that brought the teaching. He's the one that pointed to me. He's the one that placed me here. He's the one with the plan. Jesus was no narcissist. He had no hubris effect in him, as we often see in modern companies. He brought glory to the one who sent him, and that's why verse 18 says he had no falsehood in him. Can you say that of somebody in our modern day? It's very difficult to show people to be true. But that happens when you're not seeking your own glory. Jesus was not seeking his own glory. He was seeking that of his Father. And then, after this first part of examination between verses 16 through 18, we get to Jesus' second response. So Jesus showed them in his first response that their lifestyle really was the cause of their ignorance towards the law, because they couldn't even fulfill the law and they couldn't even act on the law. They didn't even know the law. That's why they couldn't respond to Jesus. And then Jesus goes further because he attacks the religion even more, and not only them, but everyone else that's standing there. You got to remember, there's a crowd in Jerusalem. There's often crowds. It doesn't mean that they were all religious, because crowds build, and when you see crowds, people just kind of keep piling in. There's people there. So Jesus will not only confront the religious authority, Jesus will confront everyone in general in his second response. And so read with me verse 19 when Jesus shows them what the issue is. In verse 19, Jesus says, "Has not Moses given you the law? Yet none of you keeps the law. Why do you seek to kill me?" And so what Jesus is doing here is showing their lack of righteousness, because they don't even do what their law says. And that's difficult for them to hear. And this is, again, light showing darkness. No one likes to be told the truth in their face, even though they say, "Tell me when I'm wrong." No, they don't really want you to tell them when they're wrong. It's hard to accept. Moses gave them the law, and they don't even keep it. That is why, as we saw in verse 1 of chapter 7, they seek to kill him. Jesus has shown this amazing authority that he has from God, and still within their hearts, they seek to murder an innocent, righteous man, which flies in the face of the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not kill. What are they going to kill him about? What are they going to make up? So this Moses-like prophet that Moses himself spoke of stood right before them, and they reacted with this harsh bitterness that would lead them to murder and break their very own law. Verse 20 goes to prove that it isn't just the religious authorities, it is the crowd. What does verse 20 say? The crowd answered. It's not the religious authorities, it's the crowd answered, "You have a demon. Who is seeking to kill you?" You see the irony here? It just gets even more ironic. Jesus just said that he comes from God, has shown a life that comes from God, has preached a message that has come from God that should have been known, and the response of the people is, bro, you're demon possessed. You're a devil. You are working on the side of the devil. You see that? You feel that tension right there? See, friends, this is what I tell you. Like, no one's willing to accept the gospel. Religion doesn't do it, and the others in the world won't do it. You're demon. Basically, in layman's terms, in that time, on a superficial level, it was like, you're crazy. You're saying who's seeking to kill you? Like you're crazy, bro. Like, come on. They're attributing to Jesus the works of the devil. Jesus, unlike ourselves, responds by further pointing them to their incorrect use of the law. I would have replied, man, you have a devil. You're the devil. I would have replied, we all would have replied in our very own ways. Jesus goes on to further his argument by showing them between verses 21 through 23 that they break their laws by fulfilling their customary oral traditions. Avoids this name calling by furthering what hurts them the most. Their oral traditions will not save and cannot properly heal a person in their heart. How does he do so? He points to circumcision. He says, basically, by coming back with that argument in chapter 5, when he healed somebody on the Sabbath, Jesus says that when they circumcise somebody on the 8th day, and if it falls on the Sabbath, basically, the Sabbath is you can't do any of that on the Sabbath. You can't work on the Sabbath. But in order to keep with the oral tradition of the law in their times, they would circumcise somebody because it would come not only from Moses, but Jesus says from the patriarchs, from the fathers, like Abraham, to circumcise. So there's obviously a greater and lesser in the law and even in their oral tradition. And Jesus points that out and says, you guys are just hypocrites, man. Like, look at this. You guys do this yourselves by healing and by circumcising a small part of the body. And yet when Jesus does it, he does it with the whole body. He does it with the entire person. It's a greater command. It's a greater effect. And they get angry. And what's going on here at a deeper level? Well, this is where we see Jesus juxtaposed with Moses and the law. And just as in being juxtaposed in the Feast of Tabernacles and being the greater tabernacle, we once more get the sense that Jesus is the fulfillment of this great law to a greater sense, and therefore is a greater Moses. See, the law in Moses' time was always partial. It was always halfway. Never did its job completely. It did it effectively, but it was never complete until Jesus comes to complete. The law circumcises the body part, a small body part to make it clean, and Jesus circumcises the heart in order to make the body holy. Moses redeemed Israel from slavery to Egypt. Jesus redeems his people from being slaves to sin. From Moses onward, no one was able to keep the law of God perfectly. Jesus was the perfect man who kept the law of God perfectly and ultimately fulfilled it. And they're missing this entire reality in Jesus. What's the final response? Third and final response. After pointing out their ignorance to the law, after pointing out their faulty execution of religion and law, Jesus points out in his third response the effects of being ignorant. How does he do so? He points to the law again. And he says, judge righteously. See, in the law in Deuteronomy, they were to appoint judges to judge the people with righteous judgment. And Jesus calls everyone, including the religious authorities, to judge correctly, but they can't because they're blinded by receiving and seeking their own glory from one another. They follow the letter of the law, but not the spirit of the law. He calls out all the gossipers in the crowd, all the name callers in the crowd that were keeping the feast or celebrating the feast, and he calls them out as well. And he summarizes this entire section between verses 1 through 24 by saying, you must judge correctly. Krinete, krisin, krinete. Two imperative verbs and one noun that say the same thing. Judge, judge, judge. What have I been telling you from the beginning? You got to make a decision what you're going to do with Jesus Christ. And so Jesus Christ, in this summary, he himself is summarizing everything that we've been discussing by pointing out to them, now you be the judge. And the way you've been keeping the law and all this religious activity that you've been doing has been pointing to you to wanting to kill me, Jesus is saying. But now he's giving them another chance. Judge, judge, judge. And judge accordingly. How not to judge? Jesus says in verse 24, not by outward appearance. What did the religious leaders and what do people want? They want the prestige that we mentioned. Jesus says, don't judge that way, because if you do so, you'll be wrong. And obviously that's what they were doing, and that's why they were wrong. Jesus says, judge with righteous judgment. Seek to do God's will, and therefore your judgment will be correct. In similar fashion, Jesus calls us out. To all of us in our church clothes, doing our Sunday morning church thing, this custom that we have. For those of us who have been Christian for years, for those of us who have it all figured out, Jesus says, don't measure me in the same way you measure the world. Don't judge me by earthly standards. Don't judge Jesus by his appearance or externally examining for your own glory. Don't seek glory pretending to seek God's glory. Seek Jesus and judge correctly because your life depends on it. So at this stage in the game, at the public square of Vida Abundante, in the most public place of Vida Abundante, Jesus is calling every single person here to judge correctly. Don't be blinded by religion, friends, because there's a lot of religious Christians. Don't seek your own glory and then fail to see what Jesus says. Judge correctly. This is for you, and the ball is on your court. Judge righteously. Let's stand up this morning.